Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. Um, this webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, and the topic for today's webinar is how states can address load growth while decarbonizing. The date today is March 11th, 2026, and we have some excellent guest speakers with us today, but before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few webinar logistics. All attendees are in listen-only mode, so your webcam and microphone are disabled. The chat function is also disabled, so if you would like to submit questions and comments, you can do so via the Q&A panel. We'll be saving about 15 minutes at the end of the presentations to address audience questions, so please type your questions as you think of them, and then we'll get to them at the end. Automated captions are also available. The speakers' bios will be made available in the chat as they're being introduced. And finally, this webinar is being recorded. We will email you a webinar recording within 48 hours, and it will also be posted on CESA's website at cesa.org/webinars. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to our host for today, Warren Leon.
Hey, thanks very much, Serene. Let me tell you that this webinar is being brought to you by the Clean Energy States Alliance. We're a national membership organization, a coalition of public agencies, mostly state agencies across the country. And if you look at the next slide, you can see logos of our members. We have members in 21 states, and there they are. And if we go to the next slide, we work on a range of topics, but one of the ones we work on that's relevant in part to today's webinar is energy storage policy. We provide support to CESA members and other states that are engaged in developing energy storage policy programs and regulations. If we can go to the next slide, today we're focusing on this topic, how states can address load growth while decarbonizing. And this webinar builds on a report that came out in January with a very similar title, as you can see. And you're going to be hearing from one of the authors of that report, Todd Olinsky-Paul, as one of the speakers. If we can go to the next slide, let me tell you a little bit about our two speakers today. Todd Olinsky-Paul is CESA's Senior Project Director, and he was co-author of that paper that we just looked at. He's a nationally recognized expert on energy storage. He directs the Energy Storage Technology Advancement Partnership, and he leads two working groups of state officials, one on energy storage policy and the other on aggregated distributed energy resources, which are also known sometimes as virtual power plants. After we hear from Todd, who will cover the content in the recent report, we're going to hear from Commissioner Philip Bartlett of the Maine Public Utilities Commission. He's going to discuss how that state is responding to rising electricity demand and addressing affordability. Commissioner Bartlett has been chair of the Maine Public Utilities Commission since 2019, and he's a leader in the world of public utility regulators. He serves as president of the New England Conference of Public Utility Commissioners, and he's on the board of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. His perspective on energy issues has been informed by his background as a lawyer and by 8 years in the Maine Senate, including 2 years as Senate Majority Leader. So we'll hear from Todd and Philip Bartlett, and let's start with the first presentation from Todd. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Warren. I'm going to pull up my slides, we hope. And hopefully you should now be seeing the first slide.
You got them.
Great. Okay, so what I want to do is to leave enough time for the other presenter and questions. So I'm going to go through a few of these a little quickly. Of course, they'll all be archived along with the recording on our website so folks can go back and look at anything you might have missed later. Also want to let you know that while I am one of the co-authors of the report, Warren himself is the other author, so it's in part his fault as well as mine. Okay. A third thing I should tell you is that the report we're talking about today actually builds on a previous report that came out in July of 2025. That one was titled Load Growth, What States Are Doing to Accommodate Increasing Electric Demand. So that one was sort of a survey of what's happening. This one is looking at what states could do to attempt to continue to advance decarbonization and at the same time address load growth. So if you haven't read the previous report, you want to check into it. Again, that's also on our website. And here is the report we're talking about today. And so I'm going to attempt to summarize it. Basically, we present 4 strategies and ask 3 questions. The 4 strategies are planning for load growth, advanced planning for load growth, minimizing load growth through efficiency, addressing peak load, and promoting clean energy technologies. And then the 3 questions will be, can distributed generation help? Can energy storage help? And what about small modular nuclear reactors? So that's what you have to look forward to. And we'll start with the first strategy, planning for load growth. So when you hear people talking about load growth and citing sort of dire forecasts, it's presented often as a sort of monolithic thing. And so it can be used by proponents of fossil fuel generation as an argument for sort of general expansion of generation, transmission, distribution all over the place. But the fact is that load growth is not uniform, is not happening in the same way in all places and at all times. So the only way to know what is needed to accommodate load growth in any particular state or any particular region is to study it in that specific location and pay attention to the timing and seasonality. And what I mean by that is seasonality obviously is the seasons, but timing has to do with when load growth is predicted to occur, which has to do with what its sources are, and how fast, and also at what times of day. So is it data centers that are going to be developed very quickly and running 24/7? Is it coming from electrification, which might be developing a lot more slowly and may not be affecting things around the clock? So that's important. Then you have to ask yourself, once you've figured out what really is going to be happening in your area and when and what it looks like, then you have to ask yourself, well, what can we do to meet that anticipated load growth with actions other than new fossil fuel generation, which is kind of the point of this report. And the answer to that should inform all sorts of state energy planning. So, secondly, efficiency. This seems like a no-brainer. Efficiency is almost always a good thing. There's a couple different ways to look at this. One is that you can sort of promote overall efficiency, but in this case, we're talking about efficiency applied to new large load customers. So that's data centers, manufacturing, and crypto mining, and that sort of thing. So developers of these projects may prioritize getting them built fast over making them energy efficient. And there's reasons for that. They're trying to capture a fast-growing market. They are rushing to build in order to avoid import tariffs and this sort of thing. But states and municipalities also have a role here and can insist that new large load facilities be energy efficient. And so we have a bunch of examples of that. One is there was a bill in Virginia that would have sales and use tax exemptions for data centers that meet energy efficiency standards. Similar bill in Texas. California has building energy efficiency standards that include efficiency requirements specific to computer room cooling centers. So you could see how that might be useful. ASHRAE, the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers, has developed energy standards for data centers, and those have been incorporated into some state and municipal building energy codes. I do want to note that legislative attempts to regulate data center energy use have not yet been successful. At least we haven't been able to find any examples. So it may be that sort of regulatory approach might be more successful right now than a legislative approach. Now, two common methods that states and municipalities use to regulate building energy use and emissions are building energy codes and building performance standards, and they're a little bit different. Building energy codes set minimum requirements for new construction, and building performance standards are designed to apply to existing buildings to meet specified levels of efficiency and over their lifetimes. So in order to do that, you have to go through a process of benchmarking and then regular improvements and reporting. The building performance standards have been enacted by a number of states, including Colorado, Maryland, Oregon, and Washington, and cities, Washington, D.C., Boston, and New York City. So these are available both to municipalities and to states. And there is some good information and technical assistance available from DOE on these. So if you're interested in BEC or BPS, go check out the DOE Building Energy Codes program. There's a link there. And again, you can get that from the slide deck, which will be archived on our website. One novel approach, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but it is something that it is a problem that has been addressed outside of the U.S. We can look abroad to the European Union's data center reporting requirements. There is a European Commission Energy Efficiency Directive, which includes a section specifically focused on data centers, and that's something that may warrant a closer look by some cities and states. Third strategy is to address peak load. I'm going to spend a little more time on this one because it's one that we think is potentially quite valuable. So what's the relationship between load growth, peak demand, and decarbonization? There's more information in this in the earlier report, so I do encourage you to look at that. But there are three main reasons to view load growth through the lens of peak demand. For one thing, excess capacity is lowest during peak hours. What I mean by that is our grid and all of our generation, transmission, and distribution assets are built to meet and exceed peak demand hours. So demand is not consistent across time. It rises and falls. And so when you're building any kind of system, you have to meet the peak requirements of that system. But inevitably, that means that there are times when demand is going to be below peak. There are off-peak hours, and so there's a lot of surplus or idle capacity in the system during those times. Peak power is the most expensive power on the grid, is another reason to address peak load. And fossil fuel peaking plants, which are the resources that meet those peak hours, are highly polluting. So if you're trying to decarbonize and you're trying to advance affordability as well as decarbonization, and you'd like to address load growth in a way that meets the requirement without going overboard, it really does pay, I think, to look at peak demand hours. And here's a little more information about some of these. So I said excess capacity is lowest during peak hours. So there is a lot of excess capacity during off-peak hours. And you can see this in some of these statistics. So 98% of the time, more than 10% of electricity generation capacity is unused. And 95% of the time, more than 20% of that capacity is unused. In fact, in 2022, the natural gas fleet in this country ran at only 57% of its full potential. So you can see there's a lot of idle capacity in the system. And that means that for most of the hours in the year, which are off-peak hours, the projected growth in demand could be accommodated by the existing system because of that idle capacity. Really, the issue is accommodating additional demand during what are currently peak demand hours. So to illustrate that, you can see whoops, let me go back. There's two curves here. The lower curve is our current demand curve. It's just an example. And then if you were to add, for example, a bunch of data centers which ran 24/7, you would push that curve up and it would go up uniformly. So it would go up as during off-peak hours and during peak hours. But the difference is that those off-peak hours, if you look at that arrow on the left, the valley of demand, even when you increase it, it still doesn't reach the old peak level. So it's still below, it's still within the capacity of the current system to handle it. When you look at the right-hand arrow, you see that the peak also, of course, goes up, creating a new peak, and that's what you have to address. So we may not need to address those off-peak hours as much as we need to address the peak hours. I did mention that peak power is the most expensive power on the grid. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but there was a landmark study in Massachusetts showing that 40% of the overall cost of power over a year was attributable to just 10% of the hours. So that really shows you how costly meeting those very few peak hours is during the year. And actually, Clean Energy Group, our sister organization, found that peak electricity in New York City is priced up to 1,300% higher than the average cost of electricity in New York. So peak power really is extremely expensive to service. Flattening peaks, shifting excess capacity from off-peak periods to peak periods can be quite a bit of savings. And of course, all of the peak load service is paid by the ratepayers, and it comes in the form of capacity costs bundled into your electric bill in various ways, depending on whether you're a residential or commercial customer. Finally, I mentioned that fossil fuel peakers are highly polluting. They're also often cited in low-income communities, communities of color and underserved communities, and therefore they disproportionately impact the health of the folks that live there, as well as the health of local ecosystems. And so for all of these reasons, policymakers should approach planning for load growth as an opportunity to reduce the difference between peak and off-peak demand, and to reduce the reliance on fossil fuel peaker plants. So how to do this? Well, there's a bunch of different tools and ways that this can be approached. One is user flexibility, and there's a lot of confusion at the moment as to how flexible things like data centers, manufacturing, and crypto mining can be. It varies, but flexibility is quite valuable. So there's a study from Duke University found that 76 gigawatts of new load, which is equivalent to 10% of the nation's current aggregate peak demand, could be served with existing infrastructure, so that's no additional investment, provided that new large load users could accommodate an average annual load curtailment rate of 0.25%. So 0.25% is not a lot. If you increase that to 0.5%, you could serve 98 gigawatts of new load just with flexibility, and at 1% curtailment rate, you could serve 126 gigawatts of new load. So can they be flexible? It depends. Crypto mining can be highly flexible. AI data centers less so, but there are some examples where AI data centers have been willing to be a bit flexible in return for things like expedited grid interconnection. So that is one example of a tool that could be used, for example, to get some flexibility from data centers. Another strategy is to target peak demand generally. So, of course, if you are anticipating new large load users that are going to add to peak demand, but you can target peak demand generally and try to bring it down, well, then you can accommodate some of these large load users adding to it. So there are many ways to do this: demand response, demand side management, virtual power plants, time of use rates, critical peak pricing, active managed EV charging, energy storage procurement or energy storage incentives, and peak targeting programs such as the Clean Peak Standard in Massachusetts. I won't go through all of these, although we do a bit in the report just for time considerations, but there's a lot of really powerful tools here that states can exercise, and most of them are in use to some degree, but we can certainly scale some of these up. And the fourth strategy on our list, promoting clean energy technologies in general. You can also promote them specifically in connection with large load users. So the difference here is if you are promoting clean energy technologies in general, you might, for example, think of a state RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standard, which is a traditional way that states scale up renewables. If you are looking at incentivizing or promoting clean energy technologies specifically in connection with new large load users, you might think of a requirement or an incentive for data centers, for example, to develop renewables and energy storage on site. So they might be sited next to a solar farm, for example, and have some batteries. That would mean that your addition of new load through that data center would be partly offset by its use or its ability to use those local resources. And adding storage in there would mean that they could sort of target that at those peak demand hours and therefore maybe be a bit more flexible. So, for example, there was a recent bill in California that would provide tax cuts to data center developers in exchange for their being willing to source 70% at least of their energy from zero emission sources. So that would be an example. Okay. I said we were going to go through our strategies and then our questions. So we had three questions that we tried to answer. One was, can distributed generation help? And when I say distributed generation, I'm talking about things that are on the distribution system, not the transmission system, often behind customer meters. So these are things like rooftop solar, batteries in people's garages. It doesn't just have to be residential, it can be commercial as well, but all kinds of distributed resources. The answer to this is pretty emphatically yes. There is an enormous potential for scaling up distributed generation and distributed energy resources of all kinds, which includes all kinds of efficiency, includes all kinds of demand response. According to, well, I guess it's not NREL any longer. It's, I don't know how you pronounce it now, National Laboratory of the Rockies, formerly NREL. The U.S. technical potential for rooftop solar PV alone is over 1,000 gigawatts of installed capacity, which would generate over 1,400 terawatt hours of annual power generation. So that is equivalent to 39% of the national electric sector sales in 2016. So in other words, just rooftop solar alone could handle almost 40% of our national, up to the 2016 national electricity use. According to US DOE, the peak coincident, now this is different because it's targeted again at those peak demand times. The peak coincident distributed energy resource technical potential is 315 gigawatts by 2030. Well, what does that mean? So if you look at the chart here, you'll see that there are a lot of different projections of the peak demand growth over 5 years between 2025 and 2030. The most aggressive of those, well, I'm sorry, this is year by year. I'm sorry, this is year on year. So we have 2022, 2023, and so forth. So by 2025, we're looking at growth of 166 gigawatts in 5 years, 166 gigawatts. Compare that to the 315 gigawatts of peak coincident DER technical potential that DOE says we have. So now technical potential is not the same as market potential. Technical potential simply means that any place where you could develop something, you will develop it, and we know that isn't going to happen. So technical potential is always an exaggeration. On the other hand, market potential, and I've looked at this recently in New England for another report that I've been working on, is often an underestimate. And so current market potential estimates in New England for solar, for example, say that by 2030 we'll have X amount of solar. Well, we already have more than that now, and it's only the beginning of 2026. So we know that all of these different kinds of forecasts and estimates are likely to be off to some degree one way or the other. The point here is that there's an awful lot of potential for distributed energy resources to contribute, especially during those peak hours, and we really need to scale those up if we want to continue decarbonization and meet rising peak demand. The second question we were to address is, can battery storage help? Again, our answer is yes. According to the National Lab of the Rockies, under current grid conditions and market rules, 28 gigawatts, if we installed 28 gigawatts of 4-hour battery storage, we could use that to provide peaking capacity in the US. So in other words, the ability of storage to address peaking capacity there is a limit to it. You don't have you can't infinitely reduce peak through storage, because if you think of peak as a mountain, as you chop off the top of the mountain, each time you take another slice off the top, the mountain tends to get wider and wider as it goes down, and eventually you exceed your battery duration, which is, currently lithium ion is about a 4-hour, 6-hour you can do up to, maybe 7 or 8 hours at the outside. So there's a limit to but all the batteries in the market right now are 4-hour, pretty much. So there's a limit to what 4-hour battery storage can do. And what they're saying is that limit is around 28 gigawatts. Okay. However, if you add more solar to the system, then you increase the utility of those lithium-ion 4-hour batteries. So if you scale solar up, supply up to just 10% of the nation's electricity demand, this would increase the practical potential for 4-hour storage from 28 gigawatts to 50 gigawatts or beyond. So it's not set in stone. It is going to vary a lot depending on what other resources are on. The point is that if you increase renewables and increase storage in concert with each other, you can increasingly address a bigger and bigger slice of peak demand. And the third question we wanted to answer is, what about small modular nuclear reactors? Well, everything that we've been able to find on this indicates that these are unlikely to reach commercialization within a decade of today. They are also likely to be expensive, at least at first, compared with both legacy fossil fuel and with renewables. And there's a lot of potential stakeholder reluctance to overcome. People remember some of the nuclear disasters of the past and may have some questions to ask about a new generation of nuclear generators. So for these reasons, SMRs, small modular reactors, seem an unlikely candidate to address load growth in the immediate future. Our conclusion in this report, states can meet load growth while advancing decarbonization, but it will require action on multiple fronts. So those include advanced planning, efficiency requirements for new large load facilities, focus on peak demand management and developing those peak resources, scaling up distributed resources and virtual power plants, and faster scaling of clean energy technologies generally, including both renewables and storage. That's the good news. The bad news is that these strategies have not to date been the primary response to load growth. Instead, if you look at what states are actually doing, and again, this goes back to the earlier report, the focus has really been on increased investments in fossil fuel infrastructure, mainly natural gas. And so that's where we are right now. I hope that we've been able to give a little bit of a perspective on where we could go if we wanted to meet this challenge in a cleaner, probably more cost-effective in the long run way. It's going to require a concerted effort to bend the investment curve toward clean energy resources if we want to avoid a massive surge of fossil fuel investment in the electricity sector. And if we did have that massive surge of investment in fossil fuel generation, transmission, and so forth, we would likely feel the effects for many decades after load growth has leveled off. Well, that is my presentation. I hope that it's helpful, and I'm going to stop sharing and pass this back to Warren, who can introduce the
Thanks
next
very
speaker.
much, Todd. That was very helpful. Good overview of the report. And we're now going to hear our second presentation from Commissioner Phil Bartlett.
Good afternoon. I hope everybody can see the slides. They are.
We can see the slides, but we're seeing it in presenter mode, so we see the slide as well.
Bill, if you click display settings on the top left and click swap presenter and slide view, there we go.
Does that work?
Yeah, perfect.
Excellent. I think I just clicked on the wrong screen. Good afternoon. It's great to be with you all this afternoon. I think that was a great presentation, which kind of leads into some of what I'm going to be talking about, the work we're doing here in Maine. To start, I just thought I'd set the framing here in Maine and kind of what we are looking at going forward. Maine has set pretty aggressive decarbonization goals, both in terms of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions to get down, reduce them by 45% by 2030, and eventually get to a place of carbon neutrality by 2045. We've also ramped up our renewable portfolio service requirement in order to get to 80% renewables by 2030, and an overall goal of 100% clean energy by 2040. So those are pretty aggressive targets we have here in New England. And in order to meet them is going to require not only significant addition of renewable generation over the years ahead, but also really trying to electrify our heating and transportation sectors. In Maine, still about half of our homes heat with oil, and we are a rural state, and the transportation contributions to greenhouse gas emissions continue to be very, very high. So in terms of our pathways of getting there, the Department of Energy Resources here in Maine has looked at kind of what it's going to take to kind of meet some of those targets. To help us get there, we've set aggressive heat pump adoption rates. To initially a goal when Governor Mills came into office, there was a goal of 100,000 heat pumps installed by 2025. The good news is we blew through that goal And that has been increased to a goal of 175,000 heat pump installations by 2027. That is the reason that is effective in Maine is, again, because so many of our homes heat with oil. So it's pretty cost effective for folks to make that transition. And I think particularly if we continue to see a lot of volatility in the price of oil and increases in the years ahead, that's just going to drive more and more of that heat pump adoption, in addition to the incentives that are provided here in Maine. And then secondly, we have on the transportation side, aggressive EV targets with a goal of 219,000 light-duty EVs on the road by 2030. That goal is unlikely to be met at this point. We relied heavily on the federal tax credits. Maine still does have incentives in place, so we will still continue to see progress, but probably not quite at the rate that was initially anticipated. I just wanted to highlight a little bit of what's going on sort of here in New England and why the Commission in Maine has gotten very interested in looking at peak load reduction. This is an example of a typical day in January here in New England, which shows the classic duck curve. You see that there in the morning hours, you see electric demand grow significantly as people are waking up, going into the office, sort of getting the world up and running for the day. And then there's a huge dip in the middle of the day that is really reflective of a lot of behind the meter solar that is already installed in the region that just sends that load cratering. And then it peaks, you get your sort of daily peak in the evening, again, as people are sort of heading home as the sun's going down. So that creates, I think as you just heard, we have a lot of capacity on the system that is built to serve those peak hours, and the rest of the day it is significantly underutilized. So there's a real opportunity here to avoid significant new investments in infrastructure to serve the additional load that's we expect to come on, if we can avoid adding those peaks and instead try to fill in the troughs. This is just an example of the pricing in New England. This shows pretty significant variation over the course of a day. It can be a swing of $100 a megawatt hour. It can be much more than that. In New England, ISO New England has an ISO to Go app for any of you in the region that want to download it and take a look. And you can see throughout the day really dramatic shifts in both the demand and in the price of electricity over the course of the day. There are times when the price is zero or negative, and other times of the day where it just goes soaring very, very high, particularly during some of the colder winter months or some of the peak hot summer days. So one reason that I think we all should be caring about things like time of use rates and trying to level out the demand over the course of the day is there's a lot of savings for consumers that are involved here. Right now, most customers are agnostic about when they use electricity because they are not on any kind of time of use rate. They're paying a flat rate no matter when they use it. If we can figure out how to better incentivize folks to be utilizing electricity when it's cheaper, that can bring down the overall cost of electricity for everyone and provide meaningful savings today. One of the things that really drove home, I think, for us in Maine and I think around New England about the need to really ramp up our effort to try to reduce the growth in the peak was a study that the states asked ISO New England to do looking 30 years in the future. We wanted to get a sense of what the grid would look like if the demand grew at the rates that we were expecting and based on the types of generation that we thought would be adding in the region. So ISO New England went and did a look at the system and the kinds of investments that would need to be made to accommodate it. And an interesting part of that report was that they identified, based on the expectations of the states and the policies that were in place, we could expect peak demand to rise to 57 gigawatts by 2050. And that would cost about $25 billion to build out just the transmission system. So this is not even looking at the distribution level, but just the transmission system would be spending $25 billion in the region. If, however, we could reduce that peak demand by about 10%, we could significantly reduce the cost of the build out and save about $10 billion. So a 10% peak reduction can save $10 billion for ratepayers in New England. I think that got everybody's attention and recognizing that we need to focus on things like demand response, on time of use rates, what can be done as we're expecting this load to come on to make sure we are not just driving up that peak unnecessarily, because there's real money involved for consumers. The alternatives, I think you've already heard, and I'm sure most of you on this call are well aware. How do we encourage smarter energy use? One clear rate is time of use rates. Our rates were established at a time when we had very traditional meters that couldn't measure the time of use and monitor that over the course of the day. So we had a just one price fits all system. Today, we know that the costs are very different depending on when you're utilizing electricity, and a relatively small number of users are driving up that peak demand and costing us all significant amounts of money. So a lot of analysis has been done that suggests that 50 to 60% of customers can save money by making no change in their behavior just by moving to time of use rates. So part of a reason to do it is to ensure that costs are more properly allocated. And then secondly, to provide a better pricing signal to encourage folks to shift their usage away from those most expensive periods and help reduce costs for everyone. You can also design particular electric technology rates, which we've started to do in at least pilot forms here in Maine. We have particular rates that can be used for EVs or for heat pumps, which are designed to, again, as you're bringing on this new demand onto the system, how do we get them enrolled in pricing options that can both save them money, but also encourage smarter use of the electric grid? And obviously, the benefits are not only to those individuals who are signed up who can save money on day one, but also to all ratepayers at large by reducing the need to build out the grid and also reducing the number of hours we're calling on those expensive peaking units that you've heard about already. So here in Maine, we opened up a docket, initially an inquiry, and now it's moved into a formal proceeding to look at time of use rates. And again, this was really, I think, the three commissioners looking and saying, we know that demand is going to be coming. We don't have a lot of data centers yet, but we know we're going to be adding a lot of heat pumps and we're going to be adding a lot of EVs over the next decade or so. And we need to think about how to do that responsibly and not having to continue to build out the distribution and transmission system. It's also something from an affordability play that we can help customers to save money today, right? If you can put someone on a time use rate and they can save $20 or $30 a month at a time when affordability is front and center, that's meaningful relief for folks. So you're rewarding individuals for the contributions they're making to help lower the cost of the grid. So that was really the motivation. And we've opened the docket, and I have to be a little bit careful what I can say because it is a contested docket. But I can say kind of in broad brushstrokes what we're doing. One, we're exploring how to develop time of use rates that would apply not just to the delivery side of the equation, but also to our standard offer supply, which is our default service. In Maine, we are a restructured state, so we do not regulate the generation at all. We are simply regulating the delivery. So traditionally, while time of use rates have been offered for a very long time in Maine, they're only offered on the delivery portion of the bill. And we thought it'd be smart to take a look at the supply side because about 90% of our customers are on the default service. So if we could come up with a time of use rate that applied to the entire bill, that could really magnify the savings and send a better signal to consumers. One of the most contentious issues in the proceeding is whether it should be an opt-in or opt-out. Again, we've had opt-in rates in Maine for a very long time. The uptake is around 1%. Very few people have signed up for it. Opt-out, we know, would lead to much higher levels of enrollment, but then there are the challenges of convincing folks that that's a good idea and making sure that you're protecting vulnerable customers who may not be able to benefit from it. So that is, I think, a pretty hot button issue in the case. As we've been working through these issues, a number of stakeholders have come to the table and said, look, if the goal here is to reduce peak demand, we shouldn't be focused exclusively on time of use rates. We should look at other options that could be used either separately or in conjunction in order to help to drive down that peak. And a few examples that have come up are looking at critical peak time pricing, which is identifying those really critical times when the system is stressed and providing a different pricing structure, or a peak time rebate, simply saying if you can avoid using electricity during this critical time, we'll send money back on your electric bill. And then looking at specific EV-only charging incentives, again, to make sure that as we're bringing on more and more EVs, they're not all charging the grid during those peak hours. So that is a broad brushstrokes of the work we're doing in Maine. I would say that the reason we're focusing on the rates is because we think rate designs are important to send the signal that can then enable a lot of other things. You can build on retail demand response or even wholesale demand response programs on top of that, but getting the price signals right, we think is pretty important to setting the table for all those other interventions and really reduce program costs for other types of interventions that can be layered on top. So with that, happy to entertain any questions. I'll turn it back over to you, Warren.
Hey, thanks very much. Thanks for both of those presentations. If you could stop sharing your screen, and then there are quite a few questions have come in, and I'll ask some of them of both of you. Todd, you talked about fossil fuel peakers being highly polluting. Why are they so highly polluting?
Right. For a couple of reasons, and I should preface this by saying there's our sister organization, Clean Energy Group, has a whole project on fossil fuel peaker replacement. So if you're interested, check out the CEG Phase Out Peakers project. The reason they're highly polluting, well, one reason is that by design they ramp up and down quite quickly, and they do that because they are sitting idle much of the time, and then they are called upon to deliver peaking power during relatively brief periods when there's a spike in demand or some other large generator has unexpectedly dropped out. And so they have to quickly ramp up, and then when they're done, they have to ramp back down. And that's not how you run these kinds of plants efficiently. They want to be most efficient, they want to run at a steady state. So that's one thing, is that they're constantly ramping up and down. Another thing is that they tend to be relatively small, much smaller than a big combined cycle gas plant, for example. And so in some cases, they sort of fly under the radar in terms of emissions regulations and requirements. They may not be subject to such stringent emissions requirements as some of the bigger coal burning or bigger gas-fired plants, just because of their size. So that's basically, I don't know, Phil, if you have anything to add to that, but I think that basically is the reason.
Yeah, I think you covered it well.
Great. And so, Phil, does Maine have a definition of clean energy? And if so, what is it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's been evolving. I mean, it traditionally started out with your traditional renewables, wind, solar, fuel cells. We do uniquely Maine have biomass, which I know a lot of other states don't, but we are heavily forested state, and there's been a lot of particularly wood waste from the paper industry, and so biomass has been is part of our renewable portfolio. Standard hydro, of course. Recently, it's been expanded to look at non-emitting resources for at least a slice of our generation. So I think increasingly we're recognizing that things like nuclear or large-scale hydro, which are not emitting but wouldn't have previously fit our definition of renewable, will have an important role to play if we're going to get to a true carbon neutral future.
Great. And let me ask you another question. You talked about there being 100,000 heat pumps. Are they all cold weather heat pumps, or are some of them hybrids?
They are. I mean, I think they're all designed to work and do work pretty well, even in cold weather. I think as you get into this bitter cold, I think there are folks in Maine, a lot of folks, who continue to have supplemental heating, whether that is a wood stove or they've left their oil burner in place, either for comfort or just to make sure they have a backup. But heat pumps have performed, I think, remarkably well, particularly in newer builds. So if you have newer buildings that are designed with heat pumps in mind and insulated and ventilated properly, that they are very, very effective. I think where they can fall short is if you have an older, drafty house, which we have a very old building stock in Maine. And I think in those circumstances, particularly in those very, very cold periods, folks will kick on a wood stove or something like that. But they're definitely designed to get through those cold periods.
Great, thanks. So, Todd, you talked about how load growth was starting to drive um, development of additional fossil fuel generation. Somebody points out that 90% of new electricity capacity installed by utilities in 2025 was from renewable sources. Does that conflict with what you were saying about load growth leading to more fossil fuel use?
Yeah, I think what you have to keep in mind is that it takes a certain amount of time for especially large scale generation projects to get through the whole development process and through the interconnection queue. So yes, it is true. And if you look at interconnection queues across the country, a lot of what's in those queues is renewables and storage right now. But those projects have been sitting there, a lot of them have been sitting in those queues for a while. I think what I was trying to say is that the responses at the policy level for states that we've been able to find to predicted load growth has been largely to move in the direction of more gas development, more natural gas development. Now, that doesn't mean that that's what's being built right now. It means that states are saying that's what we're going to need in a few years' time, and let's get those things up and running and figure out how to incentivize more of them to get built. So, yeah, it might not be what's in the queue right this minute, but if it continues in this trajectory, it's what I would expect to see increasing in the queue over the next, 5 to 8 years.
Good. And Phil, I have two questions about time of use rates that pull in opposite directions. One is, how can time of use rates address older, retired, or low-income groups who may already be low power users and have little opportunity to shift use away from peak times? But then someone else writes, given what you say, it seems like time of use charges are essential for both economic and decarbonization reasons. Is there a reason not to make it mandatory as opposed to either time opt in or opt out?
I think mandatory without any kind of off ramp, I think really does put some particularly vulnerable customers at risk. For example, if you have medical reasons that you're using a lot of electricity, or for whatever reason, really can't adjust your usage, we don't want to penalize those folks. And so I think having some kind of an off ramp is appropriate. I do think that it's important to recognize that if you're a relatively low user, you probably benefit from time of use rates. Because if you're not using a whole lot of energy during that peak time, and you're going to save energy in every other hour, that's probably going to net out in your favor. Even if you have pretty high usage but constant usage, like a heat pump, heat pumps would generally benefit from a traditional time of use rate because they are using energy at all hours of the day. And so they may pay more for the usage in those 3 hours or 4 hours of a peak, but they're going to save so much more in the remaining 20 hours that's going to more than offset it. I also think it's a little bit, I bristle a little at the suggestion that lower income folks or seniors are going to be unable to make adjustments. I think seniors in particular, if you're retired and you have a flexible schedule, it's going to be a whole lot easier for you to not do your laundry, right? And during the peak period, maybe turn down, pre-air conditioning your house and turn it up a little bit in the summer during those peak hours. I certainly know as a kid, with telephones, right? They're long distance calling, even in the state of Maine, a few towns away. There were times when you did not call your grandmother, or she did not call you. It's all you, right? During those peak hours. They waited till the free nights and weekends to do it. People are very good at making those adjustments if there's real money on the table. And I think that seniors in particularly are very well positioned to make those changes. I think low-income folks, there are other utilities in states around the country that have looked at this and found that low-income customers saved at least as much and often more through the time of use rates than other populations. So I think we have to be careful about using broad brushstrokes, but I do think that having an opt-out provides ample protection for those who really otherwise couldn't make any kind of adjustment and would otherwise be penalized because of it.
Great, thank you. And Todd, you talked about distributed energy resources as being something that should be pursued. One of the folks on the meeting was asking about affordability in distributed energy resources. Are there ways to develop them that doesn't exacerbate affordability concerns or potentially lead to higher electricity prices for everyone?
Sure. And this is really important. There's I think there's a sort of myth, I guess you might call it, that somehow distributed and clean energy resources are responsible for high costs, and that's not really what's happening. There's a lot of different factors that go into the cost of electricity, but the thing that to remember is that any of these programs that are adopted by a state, so whether it's an incentive program to promote solar or storage, or whether it's some kind of efficiency program, they all have to pass cost effectiveness screens before they're adopted. So anything that is going to be costing the public money is going to be looked at carefully from a cost effectiveness point of view before it's adopted or before that design of that program is finalized. And you can look these things up. I just as one example, we worked a bit with Connecticut to help them put their energy storage solutions program into place. They ran 5 different cost effectiveness screens on that program, and the program passed all 5 screens. And these are 5 different cost effectiveness tests that are used by states. So, at that point, you have to sort of say to yourself, well, clearly, there are efforts being made. And by the way, one of those tests specifically looks at whether costs are being shifted from one class of consumers to another, and says, and if you pass that, it means that no, that's not happening. So I think that's one important answer to the question. And of course, another one is that you don't want to look at a snapshot. You want to look at costs and benefits over time. If you just look at costs in the present, you're sort of looking at half the picture. The other half is costs and benefits, and look at them over time. And that's what these cost effectiveness screens do, and so, or should do. So what you're saying is, over the lifetime of these resources, whatever they are that you're talking about, that you're going to incentivize or adopt, are they cost effective over their lifetime? As Phil was just saying, you might spend a little bit more money today, and you're saving money over the course of the month or the year. So that's another aspect to this. I guess that's enough of an answer. I don't know, Phil,
No, thank you.
You want to add anything?
No, because
No. Okay.
we only have a couple minutes left. And what I want to do is give each of you a minute to say something you haven't had a chance to say that you'd like to say, or to re-emphasize a point you would like to reemphasize. Which of you wants to go first?
Happy to jump in.
Yeah,
I think,
please.
yeah. So in terms of emphasizing, I think, you know, I think the key here is to recognize that there's no silver bullet, but that we need to figure out how to come up with a variety of different options and solutions that can help reduce the need to just build more fossil fuel. There's been, I think, as Todd noted, there's a real seems push or drive for more natural gas units. And I think that's partly because there's an urgency. You need to get a lot of megawatts quickly. Two, in much of the country, not New England, but much of the country, natural gas is still pretty affordable. And then third, grid operators love fossil units because they control them, right? They're going to be available generally when you need them, turn them off and on. I think it's important. But what we've seen is that on natural gas generators, we're now starting to see a pretty significant lead time to get a turbine. So 5 years or more to get a natural gas turbine. So it's not necessarily the fast solution that it once was. And I think that creates opportunities to think differently. We can get solar and storage installed very quickly. There may be opportunities, certainly in Maine, we're looking at onshore wind. I think we're looking at installing more batteries on the system to get a lot more out of the existing renewables, and sort of demonstrating that these are effective solutions, particularly in combination with effective demand response. And I think that's demand flexibility is the name of the game. And I think that's the race that we should be in, is figuring out how to create as much flexibility on the demand side of the equation, because that I think gives you a lot more opportunities and a lot more options to explore a diverse set of solutions as opposed to defaulting to traditional fossil fuels.
Hey, thanks very much. And Todd, your famous last words.
Yeah, I completely agree with Phil on this. I did want to address something he said earlier about how people can be very flexible about time of use rates, and I think that's certainly true. But I think the problem is that the whole sort of electric system and the way the grid works is a bit no, just not well understood by a lot of people. And so, when are those peak demand times? Do when that would be? If we had a big flashing red light in the room that started flashing when the peak time was approaching, and then you could go around and turn everything off, then you'd have that information, but we don't have that. So I think this is why things like virtual power plants are really quite effective, is that they allow either the utility or a third party that's looking at that, peak hour coming and is looking at the weather and following the signals from the ISO or the grid operator. They will send the signal. When do you need to dispatch that battery? When do you need to stop charging your EV? When do you need to turn the thermostat down 2 degrees? And that makes it all work. And I think people can opt into that and then sit back and relax and live their lives and not be having to become an expert on the operations of the electric grid and still contribute. And I think that works quite well.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks to both of you for your excellent presentations and responses to questions. Thanks also to everyone who listened in on the call and contributed questions and comments. We will have future webinars on related topics, and I hope you'll join us again when we advertise those. So thanks, everyone.